Consider the first 10 seconds after a body enters cold water, because almost everything that matters happens before the cold itself has had any real chance to take hold. A person steps off the edge of a winter dock, or a car leaves an icy road and breaks through the surface of a lake, or a swimmer wades a little too far into a northern sea, and the instant the skin meets water near freezing, the body does something that has nothing to do with willpower or preparation. The breath is torn out of the lungs in an involuntary gasp, deep and uncontrollable, followed by a burst of rapid, ragged breathing that cannot be easily stopped. The heart rate climbs sharply. Blood pressure spikes. For a swimmer, this is uncomfortable and frightening. For someone who has just fallen in unexpectedly, with the face beneath the surface at the moment of that first enormous gasp, it can be the difference between surfacing and not. Because the most dangerous thing about cold water is not the cold. It is this immediate, automatic reaction, and it begins long before the body has cooled by even a fraction. This is the detail that overturns the most common assumption about cold water, the assumption that it kills slowly by stealing heat until the body shuts down. Hypothermia is real, and it is lethal, but it is also relatively patient. In genuinely cold water, a healthy adult often has many minutes, sometimes the better part of an hour, before the loss of core heat brings on the confusion and loss of consciousness that precede death from cooling. What kills quickly in the first minute or two is the body's own response to the shock of immersion. The gasp can pull water directly into the lungs. The frantic breathing can drive a person into hyperventilation and panic at the precise moment that clear thinking is most needed, and the sudden simultaneous demand placed on the heart, asked to beat faster and harder against tighter vessels in the space of a single breath, can in vulnerable people provoke a dangerous disturbance of its rhythm. Far more people drown in cold water than freeze in it, and most of that drowning happens in the opening seconds, while the water is still merely a sensation on the skin rather than a threat to the body's core. What that reveals, once you look at it closely, is the central misconception buried inside the way we usually talk about cold exposure. We tend to speak of cold water as though it switches something on, as though it reaches into the body and awakens a dormant capacity that was lying unused, waiting to be summoned by discomfort. The physiology tells a different story. The system that cold water provokes is not asleep and never was. The human body is, at every moment of every day, engaged in a continuous and largely invisible effort to defend its internal temperature, holding it within a narrow band around 37 degrees Celsius, with a persistence that does not pause for sleep, for rest, or for inattention. Heat is constantly being generated by the chemistry of living cells and constantly being lost to the surrounding air, and the balance between the two is managed second by a control system in the brain that most people never feel working precisely because it works so well. Cold water does not wake this system. It overwhelms it suddenly and violently, and in doing so it forces into visibility a defense that has been running quietly the entire time. The center of that defense sits in the hypothalamus, a small region deep in the brain that functions as the body's thermostat. It receives a constant stream of information from temperature sensors in the skin and from the temperature of the blood passing through it, and it compares this against the value it is trying to maintain. When it detects cooling, it acts through several channels at once, none of which require conscious thought. It signals the small muscles around the blood vessels of the skin to contract, narrowing them and pulling blood away from the surface and the limbs toward the protected core, which is why hands and feet grow pale and numb in the cold, and why the skin itself can chill substantially while the vital organs stay warm. It can trigger shivering, the rhythmic involuntary contraction of muscle that produces heat as a byproduct of motion. And it reaches for the body's chemical accelerators, the stress hormones that raise the metabolic rate. This machinery is engaged to some degree whenever you feel a chill. Cold water simply pushes every part of it to an extreme within seconds, compressing into a single shocking moment, a response the body is otherwise running in gentle, constant adjustment. There is a second, stranger reaction that cold water can summon, and it pulls in the opposite direction, which is part of what makes immersion so physiologically fraught. When the face in particular is plunged into cold water, especially while holding the breath, the body can trigger what is known as the diving reflex, a pattern shared across mammals and thought to be an adaptation for conserving oxygen underwater. In this reflex, the heart slows rather than speeds, sometimes dramatically. Blood is shunted away from the limbs and toward the heart and brain. The body behaves as though it is preparing to survive a prolonged dive, rationing its oxygen for the organs that cannot do without it. This reflex is present in all of us, strongest in infants and in those who train for it, and it is the same mechanism that occasionally allows people, particularly children, to be pulled alive from cold water after periods of submersion that would otherwise be fatal. The cold and the reflex, together slowing the body's metabolism enough to buy a margin against the loss of oxygen. The trouble, and it is a real one, is that these two responses can be triggered at the same time and pull the heart in opposite directions. The cold shock response drives the heart to beat faster through one branch of the nervous system, while the diving reflex commands it to slow through another. The result, in some people, is a kind of internal tug of war over the heart's rhythm, an autonomic conflict that can produce irregular and occasionally dangerous beats, particularly in those with underlying heart conditions they may not even know about. This is one of the reasons that sudden cold immersion deserves to be treated with respect rather than bravado, and why the cheerful image of the cold plunge, as an unambiguous tonic, obscures a more complicated physical reality. The same water that can calm and the same water that can invigorate is also water that places two of the body's most powerful automatic systems into direct opposition, and asks the heart to settle the dispute. If the cold reveals an old and always active defense, it also calls upon a tissue that for decades was thought to be largely irrelevant in adults, and whose rediscovery has reshaped part of this story. Most of the fat in the body is white fat, the familiar tissue that stores energy. But there is another kind, brown fat, which does something almost paradoxical rather than storing energy. It burns it specifically to produce heat. Its cells are packed with the cellular structures that generate power, and they contain a specialized protein that, in effect, lets them run that machinery wastefully, releasing its output as warmth rather than capturing it for work. Brown fat is abundant in newborns, who cannot shiver effectively and need another way to stay warm, and it was long assumed to vanish more or less completely by adulthood. Imaging studies refined over the past couple of decades showed otherwise, revealing that many adults retain meaningful deposits of brown fat, often around the neck and upper chest, and that cold exposure can activate it, and over time, appears able to increase it. Here, too, the framing matters. Cold does not create this tissue from nothing in the moment of immersion. It activates a heat-generating system that the body has carried since infancy, one more layer of a thermoregulatory apparatus that was present and functional long before anyone decided to step into an ice bath on purpose. It is the chemical dimension of the cold response that has driven most of the recent enthusiasm, and it is also where the most careful reading is required. Cold exposure reliably raises the level of certain stress chemicals in the blood, most notably norepinephrine, a molecule that acts both as a hormone and as a messenger in the nervous system, and that is associated with alertness, focus, and elevated mood. Studies of cold immersion have documented substantial increases in this molecule, and there is reasonable evidence that some of the sharpening of attention and lift in mood that people report after cold exposure is connected to this surge. This is a genuine effect with a plausible mechanism, and it should not be dismissed. But it should also not be inflated into the claims that frequently accompany it. Much of the research involves small numbers of people, short time frames, and outcomes that are difficult to separate from the simple fact that immersing yourself in cold water is a vivid attention, commanding experience that interrupts whatever mood you arrived with. The chemistry is real. The leap from a measured rise in a single molecule to sweeping promises about metabolism, immunity, and well-being is where the evidence thins and the marketing takes over. The most reliable benefit of repeated cold water exposure is, fittingly, the least glamorous, and it circles back to where this began. The dramatic cold shock response that makes the first seconds of immersion so dangerous can be blunted by habituation. People who enter cold water regularly show, over a span of repeated exposures, a progressively smaller gasp, less violent hyperventilation, and a more controlled cardiovascular reaction to the same cold. The body learns, in effect, not to panic. This adaptation is well documented and genuinely protective for those who swim or work in cold water. It meaningfully reduces the risk that the initial shock will lead to drowning. It is a real demonstration of the body's capacity to adjust, and it is also a quiet rebuke to the more mystical interpretations of cold exposure, because what is happening is not the awakening of a hidden power, but the calming of an existing reflex. The nervous system relearning that this particular shock is survivable and need not trigger its full emergency response. All of this places the popular enthusiasm for cold immersion in a more measured light, neither dismissing it nor surrendering to it. There is a coherent physiological story in which deliberate, controlled exposure to cold acts as a mild stressor that the body adapts to, in the same general way that exercise is a stressor that produces fitness, a principle sometimes described as the idea that a small survivable challenge can leave the system more resilient than before. Within that frame, brief cold exposure may sharpen alertness, may improve mood through its chemical effects, may train the cardiovascular and nervous systems to respond more calmly to stress, and may, through brown fat and metabolic activation, have modest effects on how the body handles energy and temperature. These are reasonable possibilities supported by varying amounts of evidence. What the frame does not support is the transformation of cold water into a cure, or the suggestion that suffering in ice is a shortcut to health that bypasses the unglamorous fundamentals of sleep, movement, and nourishment. And it certainly does not support ignoring the genuine danger. The fact that the same immersion that energizes a healthy, adapted swimmer can kill an unprepared person in the first minute, or stop a vulnerable heart, or pull an exhausted body under in water just a few degrees too cold. There is a discipline in survival training built precisely around this reality, and it is worth knowing because it inverts the heroic narrative entirely. People taught to survive accidental cold water immersion are not taught to summon hidden strength. They are taught to do almost the opposite, to expect the gasp and the panic, to recognize that the overwhelming urge to thrash and hyperventilate is the most dangerous moment and that it passes, to spend the first minute simply gaining control of their breathing rather than fighting the water, to use the following minutes of retained strength to get out, or to secure themselves before the cold robs their muscles of coordination, and to understand that hypothermia, the thing they fear most, is in fact the slowest of the threats they face. The wisdom of cold water, in the only context where lives are routinely on the line, is not about awakening anything. It is about understanding a response the body produces automatically, and learning not to be killed by it. This is the quieter truth that the title circles without quite naming. Cold water is genuinely powerful, and the reactions it produces are real, immediate, and consequential. But it does not reach into a sleeping body and rouse a dormant force. It collides with a system that has been awake all along, the ancient and ceaseless work of holding a warm body steady in a world that is forever trying to cool it, a defense so constant and so effective that we mistake its silence for absence. The shock, the slowed or racing heart, the clamped vessels, the burning of brown fat, the flood of norepinephrine. These are not new abilities switched on by cold. They are the visible edge of machinery that runs every second of every life, exposed for a moment by a stress severe enough to make the invisible briefly impossible to ignore. What cold water awakens, in the end, is not the body. It is our awareness of how much the body was already doing, unasked and unnoticed, to keep us alive in the ordinary warmth we never think to question.